So my paper will be, so basically, devolution in Scotland rests upon two core mechanisms: legislative consent motions, which were previously referred to as Sewel Conventions. So we can say Sewel Conventions, you'll understand why they were originally called Sewel Conventions. And so basically either Sewel Conventions or legislative consent motions conventions, they're the same thing. And these ensure that the British Parliament will not normally legislate with regard to devolved matters without the consent of the Scottish Parliament. So that's the first thing, and you've heard about this. Is this working? No, God. Oh, is it because I'm touching this with my paper?
Yeah, it's okay.
It doesn't matter because I haven't got anything wonderful on my PowerPoint presentation. I can do without it, is what I mean. And the second thing is something called joint ministerial committees, which is the intergovernmental relation forum we were talking about earlier as well. And these are dedicated to ironing out potential public disagreements between the British and devolved governments. Since the beginning of devolution, these two arrangements have gone through a period of stability which lasted until 2007. Between 2007 and 2016, the relationship was less fluid. However, the UK government appeared keen on resolving potential disagreements. Between 2016 and 2022, amid Brexit and the COVID-19 pandemic, relations between the UK government and devolved legislatures and executives became increasingly fraught. In November 2019, Lord Dunlop's report entitled Review of UK Government Union Capability pointed out flaws in the functioning of Sewel Conventions and joint ministerial committees. And this report paved the way for new arrangements negotiated by Whitehall and the devolved executives, which were launched in January 2022. The paper will delve into the origins and the constitutional framework in which the legislative consent motion, so the Sewel Convention, and joint ministerial committees, now called Council, I'll tell you about this, how they operate. And it will explore mechanisms, how these mechanisms have evolved over the past 25 years since devolution, and the recent changes made to improve their efficiency. This is working. Wonderful. So basically, I'll have two parts, one on devolution in parliaments and one on devolution in governments. And I have a bit more to say about parliaments because there's a lot to say about Sewel Conventions. In devolved areas, the idea is that the British Parliament will not normally legislate without seeking and obtaining consent of the Scottish Parliament. This agreement is under strain when consent sought and denied by the British Parliament, and the British Parliament chooses to pass legislation anyway. The legal value and the strength of the legislative consent motion has been tested and addressed by the UK Supreme Court. Denial of Sewel Conventions has led to tense situations in a post-Brexit context where boundaries of competencies are blurred. And another constraint is the Order 35 situation where you can block a Scottish law in devolved areas in application of the Scotland Act 1998. And I'll address all of these one after the other. It's pretty clear in the Scotland Act 1998, so the one before that one, in the first paragraph of section 8, it says, subject to the application of section 29, the Scottish Parliament may pass laws, such laws being then known as Acts of the Scottish Parliament. And then they say, this section does not affect the power of the Parliament of the United Kingdom to make laws for Scotland. Okay, so clearly the UK Parliament takes precedence over the Scottish Parliament. Okay. However, at the time, Lord Sewel said in the House of Lords during the passage of the bill, and I quote, "As was the case in Northern Ireland at the turn of the century, we are counting on a convention to ensure that Westminster does not legislate in a usual way in devolved areas without the consent of the Scottish Parliament." This statement led to the adoption of a convention which framed what was originally called the Sewel Convention. Lord Sewel got a bit disgraced along the way. You can look it up if you want to have a bit of a laugh. And basically, this is now called the Legislative Consent Motion, and this is how it's referred to in the Scotland Act 2016. What is interesting is this motion says that the British Parliament seeks the consent of the Scottish Parliament when a British bill encroaches upon or relates to a devolved area. So originally, the legislative consent, the Scottish Parliament's consent was required when the British Parliament legislates in a devolved area, for instance, in the field of education. But gradually, the use of the convention was extended to areas which, although falling within the scope of reserved areas, so Westminster areas, they're likely to affect the scope of powers of the Scottish institutions. And this extension of the situation in which a legislative consent motion must be requested has not been without controversy. Lord Sewel himself described the process as, I quote, "constitutionally confused and questionable." Despite his reservations, Lord Sewel's reservations, the legislative consent motion procedure quickly became a systematic feature of the Scottish Parliament and the Westminster Parliament. During the first session of the Scottish Parliament, no less than 39 requests for approval were entered, and during the first 3 sessions of the Scottish Parliament, 171 motions were granted. Also, the legal standing of the convention evolved over the years. At the beginning, it was just a rule of conduct written in the form of a guidance note, and then it was incorporated into the standing orders. So these are the formal rules of operation of the Scottish Parliament. And finally, it became entrenched in a separate paragraph under the name of Legislative Consent Motion in Section 2 of the Scotland Act 1916. However, this is a story of from rags to riches and from riches to rags. However, since the referendum on Brexit, Sewel conventions or legislative consent motions have lost their strength on 2 accounts. First, due to a ruling handed down by the UK Supreme Court in a famous case that I encouraged you to read, Miller 1, and Miller 2 as well, I encouraged you to read. And second, because recent denials of consent were overridden without any real attempt at negotiation from the British government. So, the legal force, what is the legal force of legislative consent motions? Okay, it's entrenched into law, it's in a separate paragraph of the Scotland Act. How much is it worth, basically? So the first blow came right after the result of the Brexit referendum, when the Scottish Parliament tried to block a law allowing the British government to trigger Article 50 of the TFEU, that's a treaty for the functioning of the European Union, and begin the withdrawal process. That's the very famous case in which the British Supreme Court ruled that by a majority of 8 judges to 3, that the British government had to seek approval from the British Parliament in order to notify the European Council of its intention to leave the European Union. So that was the first question asked in Miller 1. The second question was, can devolved parliaments block a piece of legislation related to the withdrawal of the UK from the EU? And the court unanimously this time said that the devolved legislatures do not have a veto on the UK's decision to withdraw from the EU. And the Supreme Court's decision highlighted the weakness of the Sewel Convention, which is not, in fact, enforceable by courts and is merely a political tool and political convention, and I quote, the operation of which is not within the constitutional remit of the courts. Okay, so it's a convention, it's a political convention, you cannot enforce it, it's not binding. If you say no, well, that's too bad, but nothing happens, really, okay? There are post-Brexit constraints upon the Scottish Parliament's devolved powers. And thank you, Professor Duclos, for pointing out a number of cases where the Sewel Convention led to a refusal by the Scottish Parliament, which was bypassed by the British Parliament. These are examples of cases. So 9 occasions with 2 bills where the government felt consent was not necessary. No, sorry. So you'll see the interesting thing here is that a number of bills are related to Brexit, but some are not. Okay. So last week, I'll show you because that's a big thing. Last week, the House of Lords Select Committee on the Constitution. Is this not what? Oh my God, there's a curse. It doesn't matter. It's not very important. This is it. Oh, wonderful. Okay, so last week there was a big report. Is this working? Yeah. No. I'll stop. Maybe I moved too much. So in their report, the House of Lords Select Committee on the Constitution takes stock of the strain that the Legislative Consent Motion Convention has come under. And it remarks that since Brexit, and I quote, the UK government has legislated without the consent of one or more of the devolved legislatures on multiple occasions, and at times has done so on bills unrelated to Brexit. But it also places responsibility for this strain upon the central and devolved levels of government. As it notes, we also recognise that the increased occasions on which the UK government has legislated without consent may in part be the result of a trend since Brexit for the devolved governments to take a more expensive view of devolved competence. So, the withering of the Sewel Convention is not the only source of worry for the devolved governments, and Professor Duclos mentioned the Internal Market Act 2020, IMA 2020, which is a major source of concern. Indeed, there's fear that the IMA 2020 could entail fundamental changes to the effective powers of the Scottish Parliament. And basically, the European single market rules were based on principles of proportionality and subsidiarity. And they used to allow for slightly different policies in consideration, for instance, for health policies matters. But the IMA seems to provide for a more rigid approach where almost every standard applied in other parts of the UK must automatically be accepted in Scotland and in all the nations of the UK, regardless of laws passed in devolved areas. And this has led to a number of issues with Scottish laws. For example, the ban of single-use plastic and the deposit return scheme, which is also a recycling thing. 2 pieces of Scottish laws for which the Scottish government had to seek and secure negotiated exclusions from the IMA. For single-use plastic, it took over a year for the Scottish Parliament to secure an exclusion from the IMA, and the exclusion was made a lot easier by the fact that England intended to do the same on its end. So it gives you an idea of the balance of power here. Ultimately, the Scottish government is anxious that UK ministers and UK ministers only could decide whether to include whole sectors such as health, social care, transport, waste, water sewage services within the IMA principles, effectively changing the devolution settlement unilaterally without the consent of the Scottish Parliament. And in their September report that was on the screen earlier, the House of Lords Select Committee on the Constitution recommends that the government develops a clear set of criteria regarding the appropriate use of delegated powers in areas of devolved competence, since secondary legislation is not encompassed by the Sewel Convention process. Another recent confrontation that was mentioned earlier between the British and Scottish government arose with the use for the very first time of a Section 35 order, namely the power for the British government to block the passage of a Scottish bill in a devolved area. Working wonderfully now that I've stopped fiddling about. So in January 2023, the UK government used for the first time a power known as a Section 35 order to block a bill passed by the Scottish Parliament in a devolved area, and in this case, with support from MSPs of all parties. And this bill was stopped from becoming a law. A Section 35 order prevents the Scottish Parliament from legislating within its area of competence, and it was intended to be used as a last resort and only following discussions between the UK and the Scottish governments. So you've heard about memorandum or memoranda of understanding, MOUs, okay? This is basically what you get from the MOU on the notion of Section 35 orders. And it says that they're a last resort matter, and that if formal intervention should become necessary, they will tell the administration, giving them sufficient time. This notion of giving sufficient time to devolved administrations is, in fact, I know it sounds like not so important, but it's in fact crucial. Time is of the essence here, literally, because when you're not given enough time, you cannot do anything. And in fact, you pretend, people like the UK government will pretend you have been advised and you've been told about things, but if you're not given enough time, it's meaningless. It's almost an insult, in fact. So here, the MOU, the Memorandum of Understanding, is the same as the Sewel Convention. It's not binding, it's not enforceable, it's just merely a political tool, okay? So in this case, for instance, the Scottish government claims that the UK government did not reach out and did not try to find a compromise on this bill before triggering the nuclear option of a Section 35 order. Devolved executives are now concerned that the UK government may use its Section 35 power, not as a matter of exception, but as a regular feature, like they did with the Sewel Convention. Just to update this a little bit, the Scottish government launched a judicial review lawsuit against the use of the Section 35 order before the Court of Session, which is the Scottish court. It lost the case before the Outer House, or the first instance, and brought an appeal, which it eventually dropped before it was brought before the Inner House of the Court of Session. So as things stand today, the Section 35 order, triggered by the Secretary of State for Scotland, Alistair Jack MP, on 17 January 2023, was not quashed by the Court of Session, and the bill was indeed blocked from being enacted into law. So we're finished with the sort of Parliament devolution, and we'll move on to what happens between governments in my second part. So devolution and governments. we'll first look at joint ministerial committees, then we'll look at the new 3-tier arrangement, which was launched in 2022. And if we have time, that would be wonderful. We'll see. We'll look at Brexit and intergovernmental relations. So this week, again, the memorandum of understanding. But just a few things I wanted to say before we get properly started. Since the very beginning of the devolution arrangement, governments have been meeting behind closed doors to work out potential disagreements or merely to communicate on their respective agendas. These intergovernmental work groups were called joint ministerial committees. And contrary to the Sewel Convention and its statutory standing, these practices were set out in more informal and opaque documents, which are basically a memorandum of understanding, which is like an umbrella document. And underneath this umbrella document, you have other documents called concordats. Okay, so it's like a jungle, it's a maze of informal documents. None of them are binding. And lately, and further to a consensus between Whitehall and devolved governments, there has been an overhaul of the whole system, leading to a new 3-tier system. And all of this, if I have enough time, I'll address the implementation of Brexit and a network of separate, yet separate, intergovernmental agreements called common frameworks. And it sounds a bit boring, and it is a bit boring, but it's in fact very important when you look at the actual working of Brexit. So intergovernmental relations between 1999 and 2022 were set out in a memorandum of understanding, first published in October 1999, and most recently, so you're going to think that's not very recent, updated in October 2013. Okay. The MOU established a core quadrilateral forum called the Joint Ministerial Committee, comprising ministers from the UK and devolved governments. These mechanisms were always meant to be political instruments and not binding processes, as clearly stated in the MOU preliminary explanatory note and in paragraph 2 of the introduction. This memorandum is a statement of political intent and should not be interpreted as a binding agreement. It does not create legal obligations between the parties. So here you have it. No need to go to the Supreme Court for that one. It's clearly written on the paper. The main forum was the JMC, the Joint Ministerial Committee plenary. And this is the one that consisted of the 4 administrations, heads of government, and 3 territorial secretaries of state. After 2002, the JMC plenary lapsed, something perceived at the time as a sign that governmental relations were working well. At the impetus of Alex Salmond, who became First Minister of Scotland in May 2007, it reconvened in June 2008. From that point, meetings of JMCs were routinely hosted by the UK government in London, and they last met at Downing Street on 19th December 2018. There were also 2 standing subcommittees, the Joint Ministerial Committee Europe and the Joint Ministerial Committee Domestic, and a number of additional ad hoc committees on specific objectives. There was one, for instance, on poverty. After Brexit, another committee, the Joint Ministerial Committee EN on European negotiations, was established. And until 2007, disputes over tuition fees, free personal care for the elderly, and hepatitis C compensation that was between Scotland and the UK, or Objective 1 EU funding between Wales and the UK, were resolved via informal bilateral meetings. However, in 2018, amidst Brexit negotiations, the House of Commons Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee observed in a report that there was a growing consensus that the current UK intergovernmental relations mechanism are not fit for purpose. And indeed, this cryptic informal channel of informal communication between governments is underpinned by notions of trust and mutual respect. Therefore, the results vary greatly depending on whoever is in power in Whitehall and in the devolved governments. Examples of how unsatisfactory the JMC arrangement has become during early Brexit negotiations can be found in the Scottish government's proposal for a second independence referendum entitled Scotland's Right to Choose, putting Scotland's future in Scotland's hands, published in December 2019. In this document, the Scottish government lists some of the occasions during which they claim to have been ignored by the British government. Some of the examples will be given by me here to epitomize the lapse of cooperation and the breakdown of informal channels of communication between the governments between 2016 and 2022. And it's interesting that they refer to this because mum's the word when it comes to joint ministerial committees. Even if there's disagreement, you do not refer to it publicly, but here they did. So, for instance, just so that you have the context, so that's what it looks like. The joint ministerial, the memorandum of understanding, last updated in October 2013. Just so that you get the context, in October 2016, in a communique, the UK government committed to full engagement, ensuring that the interests of all parts of the UK are protected and advanced. And then they said that the new Joint Ministerial Committee would seek to agree a UK approach to and objectives for Article 50 negotiations. However, so this was the context. In December 2016, the Scottish government published a paper entitled Scotland's Place in Europe, in which it made proposals for the UK as a whole to remain in the single market and customs union. And they said that if this couldn't be done, then they wanted a differentiated deal for Scotland. The Scottish government claims that they never received a formal answer to their proposal. However, in January 2017, and allegedly without any consultation with the devolved administrations, Theresa May set out her ambition for a Brexit means Brexit, which means a hard Brexit, out of the customs union and the single market. And of course, she said no to a different deal for Scotland. The Scottish government complains that all major Brexit negotiations have taken place without any devolved executive being consulted in a serious way. And a serious way means getting documents in advance. For instance, they stressed that the Joint Ministerial Committee EN for EU negotiations did not meet at all between 9th of February and 16th October 2017, a key period for negotiations during which the UK government published several documents setting out their approach to EU negotiations. They give the example of the white paper on the future relationship with the European Union, published in July 2018 by the UK government. And they say that the UK government shared only 4 sections of the document in advance, and that they only obtained a full yet embargoed copy of the paper at 1 a.m. when publication was scheduled to occur on the next morning. This comes in sharp contrast to what happened anti-Brexit with the Joint Ministerial Committee Europe, which managed relations concerning European policy. It was chaired by the British Foreign Secretary, or the British Secretary of State for European Affairs, and they met 4 times a year, no matter what, before each European Council summit. Sadly, and this quote is going to make you weep, which is why it's not even on a slide, the Joint Ministerial Committees were described in 1998 by the Scottish Affairs Committee in the following terms: devolution is never more visibly based on compromise, good faith, and reasonable attitude than in relation to the European Union. Oh my word. Between 2018 and 2022, joint ministerial committees were either suspended or became entirely inefficient, which led to the Dunlop report previously mentioned, and resulted in a review of intergovernmental relations, with all 4 administrations agreeing to work under the new arrangement. I'll hurry up a bit. So these are the principles that are considered to be the bedrock of effective intergovernmental relations. You'll notice the positive and constructive relations based on mutual respect, building and maintaining trust based on effective communication, sharing information, respecting confidentiality, promoting understanding, resolving disputes according to a clear and agreed process. Okay, I'll move on a bit just to share this. The government described it as a landmark agreement to create a more equal, transparent, and accountable system. But Professor Nicola McEwen said that machinery matters, process and organization matter, but the culture and conduct of intergovernmental relations matters more. So we'll see what happens. I'll share just a quick thing with you. This is how it works. So they've replaced something with acronyms by something with more acronyms. The top tier is called the Council, which has a nice European ring to it, if you ask me. And then you have the middle tier and the lowest tier, and all of these are supposed to meet regularly. That's the contrast with the previous arrangement. Engagement within the new structure is to take place regularly and not just when needed, as it was before. However, there has been criticism of the inconsistent frequency of council and committees meetings since 2022, and this across all tiers of the new system. Do I have to skip my bit on the framework, or can I say just a word about it? What do you think? Oh, okay, that will do fine. So just a quick word on this notion of common framework. And basically, like I said earlier, proportionality and subsidiarity operate within the single market, but it doesn't seem to operate so well within the IMA. So the UK and the administrations have noticed that there are overlapping powers that needed to be addressed, and they've created something called common frameworks. These are mechanisms for the UK and devolved governments to mutually agree some regulatory coherence for devolved policy areas. This means they try to be coherent and consistent in the regulations that they adopt, so that in overlapping areas there aren't any hiatuses or limited. In the joint communique of the 4 administrations released in October 2017, it was said that common frameworks will be established where they are necessary to enable the functioning of the UK internal market. The UK internal market is like a mini single market, okay? Ensure compliance with international obligations, also have a word to say when there are notions of international treaties or trade agreements. That was a time where they thought they'd have plenty of trade agreements. Provide access to justice in cases with a cross-border element, and so on. What is interesting is what the Scottish Parliament Constitution Europe External Affairs and Culture Committee said. They said there should be a new memorandum of understanding to specifically address how devolution now works outside of the EU, based on a clear constitutional design, including consideration of the principles of subsidiarity and proportionality. And under Schedule 3 to the European Union Withdrawal Act 2018, the UK government has a statutory requirement to report to the UK Parliament every 3 months on progress made on developing common frameworks. But in October 2023, the UK and devolved governments agreed most frameworks, albeit almost entirely in provisional form, with 4 remaining unpublished frameworks. So that's not very. Oh, just to say, I know it's a bit rebarbative, and that's why I said it was going to be a bit painful. But in fact, it's absolutely central to the good functioning of the devolution agreement to have, on the one hand, these dual legislative consent motions arrangement, and on the other hand, intergovernmental negotiations and communications. And in Scotland, at least, they take it seriously, and they have a dedicated researcher who I met in May in Edinburgh, and her name is Annie Bozza, is right here on the paper, and she produces very factual, comprehensive briefings regarding intergovernmental relations and legislative consent motions, including a yearly summary and quarterly updates. So they can be downloaded, printed. They're described as being made for the benefit of the MSPs and personal staff, but they're published online. They're accessible to anyone. In their report, the House of Lords Select Committee recognizes the importance of a cooperative mindset in relation to devolution. They write, without goodwill and cooperation, structures and conventions risk becoming meaningless. And they recommend the operation of a new principle called a principle of positive engagement to be added to the 2022 review of intergovernmental relations. In the meantime, the Starmer administration has appointed a Minister for Intergovernmental Relations, the Right Honourable Pat McFadden, with responsibility for devolution, as his only remit, unlike his predecessor, Michael Gove, who was, in addition to being Minister for Intergovernmental Relations, he was Secretary of State for Levelling Up, Housing, Communities. Now, Pat McFadden, MP, has this as his only mission, basically. And maybe next time we meet, we'll have to discuss the case of England, because in his speech during the opening of Parliament, King Charles III expressed the wish for his government to bring forward an English devolution bill and to establish a council of the nations and regions which will bring together the Prime Minister, the heads of the devolved governments, and the mayors of combined authorities. So maybe next time. Thank you very much.